theory has to have a priority.
Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing.
The dimension of the future has disappeared.
There is actually no representation anymore.
There is no final resolution to contradiction.
Militant proletarian snake handling over abysses never gets much wilder than this.
All right, everybody, welcome back to The Dangerous Maybe. And today we are here with two very special guests that we have been wanting to talk to for a while now. They are the authors of this incredibly important new book, Exocapitalism. Nance, you got your copy there? There it is in the background.
Hell yeah.
So, yes, welcome, Roberto Alonso Trillo, Marek Poliks. And
thank you so much for having us.
It is so great to have you both here to talk about this. I keep telling everybody on social media how much I love this book and how important it is. And so I even said the other day, I'm like, I've got a really special interview coming up, and I think a few people guessed. But they're like, oh, we know. You finally got them. But yeah, but okay, we're here. We're going to talk about exocapitalism, but before we get into it, Nance, up with you.
What's up, man? I'm excited. Yeah, we've been talking about this book for months. And I'm excited. And to be honest, there was some initial resistance when I first started reading this book. I was like, this just doesn't track. And it was confounding a little bit because aesthetically it should. Aesthetically, this scratches all the itches. But then I opened it up and I was like, there's something wrong here. And then I continued to push through it. And then I realized the call was coming from inside the house. That like the thing that was wrong was that it was maybe a little bit too far beyond my framework and like my projection or whatever. I fucking love this book. I really do. Like there have been two books Mikey and I have read this year that I think are instant classics. They're going to go down in the annals of whatever it is we try to do. And this is one of them. I really do. I think this is an important book.
What's the other one? You got
to say the other one.
What's the other one?
Fliss Fetter. The Hysterical Sublime.
Oh,
hold on.
Shit,
There's a third one, and you.
Oh, I forgot about. Yeah, Cute Acceleration.
Yeah. Totally.
Those are the kind of really resonated with us.
Yeah, but I'm excited, and there's a lot. I think you guys are pushing the envelope, so to speak, and I think it's important. I think we should. I think it's clear to me that things are just becoming super regressive. Politics in general, the idea of the left is becoming some kind of weird black iron prison, and I think it's important to push it. And I think you guys are doing that. So I'm stoked.
We're absolutely delighted to be here. We've been following you guys for a long time as well, and I remember very viscerally Roberto holding up a copy of Capital versus Time Energy. What was it? December of last year, being like, we need to talk about this book. So I'm very, very, very excited to be here too.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited. You know, the book hasn't been available for a while, but Nance and I are in the process of fixing that. So hopefully in the next couple months, for real, it'll be back up on Amazon. So, you know, we're chipping away at it. So yeah, okay. I've thought about it. Like, what's the best way? Because from here on out, and I'm kind of talking to my regular audience, I'm going to be using these terms that these guys have introduced in their book on a regular basis. But it's important. Like, I feel like that's why I love it on some sense. It's almost like these terms just name something that I've had some hint of or something, but you bring them into sharp relief with these terms. And so I think that's important. But before we go into the main concepts you guys use in the book, maybe we should just start with the title itself, exo-capitalism, because it would be very easy for somebody to go, oh, there's consumer capitalism and surveillance and this is exactly what you guys are not doing. So maybe let's start just with what is the meaning of exo-capitalism and what's going on there.
Roberto, do you want to take that one? I feel like this one you always really kill this particular answer. Roberto has the flu, everybody, by the way, so just contextualize.
So I apologize for my voice. I'm down, like an octave, like pitch shifting. But
it sounds great.
The idea with EXO is rather simple. We're not actually discussing anything new. We're actually arguing that capitalism has always been the same. So we're not introducing an terminological facelift. It's not cognitive capitalism. It's not 24/7. It's not. We understand all of those perspectives as they emerge for specific interactions with the real, if you want, and they do make sense. There is a sort of coherence. There is a kind of analytical depth to them, if you want. But what we're trying to argue here is that capitalism, through that sort of grounded, if you want, phenomenological approach that kind of departs from the experience of the human as situated in reality, always produces critical frameworks that remain partial. And the idea with the book is to attempt to move beyond that in a sort of kind of ontological positioning of what capitalism may or may not be. And I think that has to do with the style as well of the way it's written. It's a book that you can read in 3-4 hours. You might have to come back to it. It's like a scalpel, it's something that cuts deep, clean. It's not meant to drag you, to stop you. It's meant to be read quite quickly. And we were trying to find something like that, because if you're able to read a book in a few hours, the experience changes. Like, then you come back to it. Maybe the first reaction is a bit disorienting or paralyzing, but then you come back to it. So the idea with EXO is that capitalism is not sociogenic, which is kind of the standard point of view, where you look at capitalism as something that emerges from, call it, Marxist approaches or post-Marxism or something that emerges from human action, from the kind of social, and it builds up from there. And the argument that we're trying to raise is that capitalism has always been there. It's a sort of transcendental entity that has to do a lot with abstraction. We'll talk about that later, and with ideas of volatility and so on, and that the human engagement with it is not relevant to capitalism itself. Capitalism could exist without humans. Capitalism is something that can exist in other materials, in other realities. And the book closes with a beautiful final page that, if people are gonna read it, it's a beautiful kind of ending that moves into the kind of sci-fi slash not truly sci-fi, but it's a poetic ending that kind of closes that. So EXO refers to the fact that it's something alien to humans. It's an outside reality. It's something that is visible, small, like an algorithm, like a virus. It's something that does not emerge from our actions, and as such, it's not something we can fully control. It's not something we can modify. So that's a kind of critical starting point, I think. Mark, you may want to expand on that.
It was great, 100%. Yeah, I mean, and to speak to all the other kind of new modes of capitalism, typically whenever we give a talk, we have a slide where we kind of show through all the different either expressions that capitalism is over and now we have something completely different, or that there's like some new paradigm shift to capitalism that's happening, and it feels like it's becoming faster and faster, the degree to which we introduce new types of capitalism or new names for capitalism. And of course, to Roberto's point, we commit that original sin of coining some new term, but we also use exocapitalism and capitalism interchangeably because we think that we're describing the same thing. So we're not describing a new epoch. Rather, what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at, let's say, Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism, or Bifo Berardi's semio-capitalism, or platform capitalism, or anything. We're trying to look at all those things and try and put them in some situation where they can all coexist as different representations of the same capitalism that Marx described, and also a variety of different economic systems that Marx left out in his analysis, which is a lot of really wacky stuff that occurred with currency manipulation and even speculative finance since the beginning of writing, and maybe even prior to that. Yeah.
So before we go into these main concepts of the book, I think talking about exocapitalism, I mean, it's to me the elephant in the room, which is exo, outside, Capital comes from the outside. And so I think one thing that the four of us all have in common is that we are unapologetically influenced by Nick Land in certain ways. In other ways, we're not. And in some ways, we are. What I guess because it's because he's a regular on the channel. I think it's important to understand. Okay, how did Land and his this idea that capitalism is from the outside? How much of that influences and shapes the way you think about this relationship between exo and capital, the outside and capital, and where does the influence stop? Where would you? What are some of the core disagreements you would have with Land when it comes to capitalism?
Totally. I would maybe start with like the writings on Bataille. We're really interested in the sun. We're really interested in energetics. Like we really do believe at the end of the day that this does boil down to energetics in a lot of respects. So we were excited about that particular, continuity, especially how that flows into, the writings of Reza Negarestani, for example, who we find to be, extremely influential in that regard too. And then, there's that proposition that is, especially apparent through the CCRU and then kind of transformed slightly, but definitely the proposition that there exists some self-assembling process. For Land, this is something that's self-assembling itself into the future, as opposed to something that there's a lot of things that self-assemble themselves very idly according to, basic algorithmic principles. I think, we like to think of this as more of like a Conway's Game of Life situation and less of a self-assembling, techno-capital singularity. That's definitely a limitation there. We do think like our main critique of Land first is that, hey, hey, Nick, if you're watching this, first is that like, this is not necessarily a person who has spent a lot of time in software. And I think that like really understanding the mechanics of software is really critical to thinking about structures like capitalism today and maybe even always. We think that there's like a lot of relationships between capitalism and computation in terms of like their ontological positions, for example. And then I think like for us, like there's a real overemphasis on the human layer, and that's especially I think a critique of the writing in the '90s, which is obviously very beautiful, but it is like very much obsessed with the apperception and experience of capital by humans, as opposed to the actual technical enumeration of what that thing is. We want more of that. Like I would have loved more of that, and that's a very common critique of Nick Land. It's like, this is beautiful. This is incredibly evocative. There's something here that is absolutely objectively predictive and maybe hyperstitionally predictive, or maybe just, really great reasoning, or maybe just pure epiphany. But it doesn't go into the detail. It doesn't really tell us how this machination works. And actually, he started to go into detail quite a lot later at a moment where we think that he kind of lost the plot. We would have loved, more kind of explanation of the mechanics of how capitalism works from that kind of 90s Nick Land place. But then from there, that's when we hop to Reza primarily as an influence, I would say. I don't know. Roberto, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think once you read the book, we kind of trace this line that starts with Deleuze and Guattari, with 1,000 Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus and so on, which we find as we define as a starting point for some of the ideas that we discuss in the book. This idea of capitalism as a sort of social machine that replaces, if you want, social systems with code. I think Nick Land plays a fundamental role in the 90s because he's the kind of first one to decouple the mechanic fever, if you want, of Anti-Oedipus from social critique. But as Marek was pointing out, there are some limitations there, especially with regards to the vision of computation as a sort of as a kind of human derivative, if you want, that disregards the possibility of computation as something that is an alterity that we've been also discussing to some extent. So this kind of reintroduction of transcendentalism or transcendental entities that we've been engaging in over the past couple of years, part of that is also with computation and the work there, of course, Reza, but also Luciana Parisi.
I was going to say Luciana, yeah, exactly. Like CCRU people, yeah.
Has been really important. So this all emerges from the 90s. This all has kind of an Nick Land check on it, but it's something that after the 90s, Nick evolved, I think, into different paths. And some of the people that were working with him in the 90s to us remain super influential. Like that was an incredible group of people. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is crazy when you think about all of them that were around in that era. Like, Sadie, Nick, Anna, Mark, Reza, Ian Hamilton Grant, Ray Brassier, Luciana. It's just
Maya, yeah.
Yeah,
totally.
exactly. It's just crazy, like what was going on work that time. So, but okay, so I think we have a good foundation. Look, everybody, point is, exocapitalism is not just a period in capitalism. It's not a restructuring of it's what capitalism is from the outset, and the exo has to do with the fact that it is something outside of human social order. It's got its own logic, its own, I don't know how you guys would feel about me using it, but drive to it. It's got its own trajectory. And this is something that is there at the beginning. I'm not sure where you guys would say the beginning is. Maybe it's virtually always been there. Because I've heard Nick talk about it like that, where even in, tribal societies, like their symbolic orders were set up, even though they didn't maybe consciously understand this, but as like protective shields against this thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. 100%. Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay.
And I would say pre-human too, though I think at a certain point when you're dealing with kind of objects that exist within this kind of transcendental plane, it becomes very difficult to think about the when of it all, because it could be all time. It could be time that's retrojected. It could be, something that's able to move in time dynamically in terms of its origin point. Like things can get really spooky really quickly, but definitely like thinking about it like a kind of Ahrimanic demon or something like that does feel like does feel like an approachable way to start thinking about this stuff. Or I think the best way that we like to think about it is like computation. Like if you think about how, like, if you ask the question, like, when did computation begin? Like, when did the kind of like ontological object of computation begin? It becomes like a very weird question. Like, I mean, it's always latent. It's always possible. Yeah.
Okay. So before we go in, I think this is the perfect time to actually say this. Okay. So for you guys, there's really only ever been two types of economies: the slavery economy and the software economy. Could you explain that distinction? To me, wage labor is wage slavery. So there's a kind of overlap if we accept that. So I guess let's just start there with the two different types of economies.
I mean, I can start with that. I think there's definitely the possibility that other kinds of economies can exist. Like, I don't mean to suggest that there are only two, but rather that at some level of scale, which is a really important principle for us, is the idea that once you have operations that are occurring at sufficient volume, magnitude, or velocity, they change. Like there's only we really kind of function within a kind of physics or a kind of ontology where once things become sufficiently big, they change their structure fundamentally, and they might align to certain principles of organization that are based on those scales, on that level, that magnitude, that velocity. That there might be some intrinsic properties that or characteristics to scale that kind of pattern what is available, like in terms economically speaking, for example. And so at scale, like, yes, definitely throughout human history over some arbitrarily defined population limit. Especially like what we love to see is we love to follow Silvia Federici's critique of Marx here very, very closely, is that there is in Marx there is this argument that there existed at a certain point a moment of primitive dispossession, where primitive accumulation rather, which was a fundamental dispossessive act that transitioned the European terrain from one that was a feudal kind of patterning to one that was a capitalistic kind of patterning, in which the land was effectively essentially removed from even the kind of anarchic local control of the peasantry, and the relationship of the peasant class to their work was ultimately subsumed into a kind of waged relationship. This was this like a cataclysmic moment for Marx in no small respect that began to kind of ultimately fashion and actually very much situate what capitalism was allowed to be. That's our critique of Marx also, is that like capitalism is put in this position in Europe and extracted from these dynamics, which is of course fundamental to a kind of materialist analysis, but is very limiting in terms of like all the kinds of weird capitalisms that could have existed prior to that moment. And what Federici argues is that this moment of primitive accumulation is actually happening constantly. And so she points very much towards, let's say, feminized labor, for example, or labor performed by undocumented people, which does tend to have very different types of dynamics, especially with respect to waged relationships, right, than the ones that we see when thinking about kind of conventional capitalist cycles. And so already for Federici, we also reference Fanon in this as well, and there's a number of other thinkers that you could place within this lineage of like there being this kind of cliff in terms of relations, that there's some types of labor, I just said labor, there's some types of labor that are ultimately non-waged or not reciprocated in terms of any kind of wage. They're essentially coerced functionally, though of course your point holds for the other class of labor, which is waged, and of course there is a coercive element to that waging. But we do think of those dynamics as relatively different. There's an argument that we love from Deleuze and Guattari that they make in Anti-Oedipus, which is if you look at this latter economy, the waged economy, we like to break that economy down in the kind of Marxian class structures where you have your proletariat, you have your bourgeoisie, you have your petty bourgeoisie, you have this whole kind of stratification of class structure. And Deleuze really makes the argument that in that space, there's actually only one class. Everything that participates in wage labor in capitalist economics is essentially a single entity that continuously kind of churns out the continued existence of that particular pattern. And we think of that as separate in a meaningful way from the kinds of dynamics that ultimately you see like on the ground when it comes to, let's say, sweatshop labor. For example, we spend quite a lot of time looking at sweatshops on the border between Myanmar, Burma, and Thailand, being actually a very different type of relationship to things like land, to things like wage, to things like vertical integration, and to things like sovereignty than what you functionally see in capitalism. So the distinction that we draw is that this type of labor, which we call maybe formally slave labor or a kind of retreat to or permutation of feudalism, actually doesn't have the same drives that we associate with capitalism, where we see these concepts that we're probably about to enumerate, like lift and drag, etc. This is actually has its own kind of internal mechanics, which are worth their own book in terms of exploration, but we focus more on the capitalism bit. But yeah, I mean, that's like, if you think about the type of labor that goes into producing, industrial textiles in sweatshop conditions, like the relationship to sovereignty there is incredibly interesting. It's like a totally vertically integrated thing. You have these camps that essentially do not, remunerate anybody for any of the activity that they perform. They're paid strictly in terms of food, and obviously not very well, and housing. Their passports are removed from them, and they exist in this like incredibly liminal, odd space that actually is starting to become, more and more predominant in terms of the experience of working people today. Sorry, that's a long-winded and a little bit scattered, but maybe Roberto, you can help me refine that.
No, I think that's perfectly clear. I think, I guess the critique there emerges from the issue with historicist approaches to an analysis of capital is that they bring into the equation a specific formation. Historical formation becomes ossified as a paradigm that then becomes a kind of method of analysis, if you want. And that's great. There are people that have this ability to understand things, systematize. This emerges, of course, from a historical tradition of thinking. Marx wasn't there on his own. But then there's a question there as to what extent that starting point can be taken for granted, or should it be taken for granted. And in the case of wage labor and the idea of slavery, I think one of the arguments that the book is trying to propose is that all reproductive economies, which are the foundation of labor, are still guided by slavery principles, by slave models and so on, and that has never changed. And actually, it has always been the same. So wage is approached, I think, from that perspective. Yeah.
That's incredibly important. Like, actually, that's something that I left out exactly, which is that, like, for us, the fundamental, one fundamental characteristic of capitalism is this phenomenon that we call lift. But we can just abstract that here into the idea that capitalism is not interested in human social reproduction at all. It doesn't want to be connected to those things. It's not interested in corporeality. It's not interested in the physical layer. It's really trying to move away from that. We track that drive throughout history. And at the same time, there do exist humans who are organizing themselves at scale and need to find some ways through which to actually facilitate their continued existence upon the earth. And that's where we fall back to this slavery mechanic, which is this, very kind of legacy economic protocol that we use to handle social reproduction at scale, because we can't use capitalism to do it because it gets incredibly weird incredibly quickly.
Okay. Nance, you want to say anything before we go into these core concepts in the book?
I think just one thing that strikes me, like thinking about that specifically, how we find new ways to justify our coexistence with this viral thing, whatever. And just real quick, I love exocapitalism. It is a xeno system, like it is this other thing, and I love it. I think the title is amazing for that reason, because it's like talking about capital and capitalism, and it's like, no, I'm saying capital is this thing, and people are like, well, all you ever talk about is capitalism. It's like, no, I'm talking about capital. It's different. There's a distinction. Anyway, now there's an emerging economy of scammers in places like India and parts of Asia, and it's very much this dynamic of, like, they move on to this scam factory and they don't get paid wages. Like, they get paid room and board essentially, and they're treated like shit. It's horrible conditions, but these things they're not incorporated per se, because they happen they don't happen in America. They happen in these parts of the world where, like, legal structures are different, but they're very much legitimate enterprises of sweatshops and scams and stuff like that.
Did you see the Meta report that, like, 10% of their FY25 earnings, like, in terms of revenue, came from just scam ads? Like, it's beautiful. It's amazing.
That's insane.
10%. That's insane. So good. Sorry.
But it's so, like, yeah, that's the world we're I think currently moving into. And it's so, I think, radically different on some level. And maybe it's just aesthetics, but it's also just more of the same. It's like, no, this has been it all along. It's just for us, we've been fortunate enough to have the benefits of living in the core, and like this kind of periphery logic, I think, is coming for all of us now. But it's not new. And I think it's important to point out to people, this is not new. This has been here all along. So.
Okay, so I'm going to leave that. Oh no,
sorry, no. I mean, we fully agree with that. I mean, but I think that there's an argument there. Sorry, Mike, to cut you there, but there's an argument there that it remains invisible, it remains hidden, but it's still there. Like we were discussing this with you don't have to go to Asia to find stuff like this. I think this is everywhere. It's just that we've managed to hide it better. We're masters at concealing things that we don't want to see in Western societies, but they're still down there somewhere. I mean, I think there's this idea that we've discussed with Ray Brassier. He's looking at this kind of critical reassessment of Marx and so on, of surplus populations, and that's something that doesn't only pertain to specific kind of geographic locations. I think that's something you can find anywhere. It's just hidden, but it's still there. It's like we've learned not to look at it internally, but I think I don't know. That's my feeling. It's not. You don't have to go that far to find that sort of realities, I think.
I mean, for me, as I approach things from this Zizekian perspective, I mean, to me, that's what ideology does, and that's what I think Slavoj got at better than other theorists of ideology, where what ideology does in part is conceal these points of traumatic antagonism, or these points of the real that are too much for us to deal with. So there has to be some way for us to go about functioning despite these points of trauma, points of the real in our society, and those points structure it. So we don't have the type of society we have without those points of traumatic real, but we also can't cope with them, so we have to cover them. And so ideology gives us narratives that, oh, well, these points of the traumatic real, oh, they wouldn't really be there if we got rid of this group or whatever. So the scapegoat ideology and all this kind of stuff. So I think that's where, when Slavoj hit the scene and everybody was talking about, oh, we're post ideology now, his whole thing was like, no, we're still going out of our way in various ways, shapes and forms to cover over these points of social trauma that we just can't cope with socially. And so there has to be some way to conceal them. So, okay. So I think this next part, I'm going to leave this to you guys, however you think is the best way to do this. So the 5 main parts of the book are devoted to like a core concept. So scale, fold, lift, drag, and the last mile. And volatility is there throughout. So it's kind of really these 6 core concepts that you guys have worked out that we'd love to hear you discuss, at least, briefly, give us an idea of what's going on with each one of these.
Totally. It's funny because we've been if anyone is interested in watching a full explanation of one of these concepts, we just put this out via New Models. We just had the European tour where we were talking through just Lift, which is like a solid hour, and that's like just scratching the surface of this concept. Not to pat ourselves on the back for a rich concept, but it's just it has so much stuff. Like it's really hard to talk about all this stuff, but I'll try and do it very succinctly.
But no, what's great about that, what you did, you give so many examples, and you go into different types of lift. Like, I feel like you guys, like, really the book laid a foundation. It's not the finished product. It laid the foundation for what you guys are now doing.
Exactly. 100%. We're going to do an American tour in the spring, I think it's the spring, maybe late winter, where we'll be talking probably through drag, I imagine, and then we'll kind of keep going from there. So we're going to go concept by concept. We're also doing a new center course, if anyone's interested, where we're going to also spend quite a lot of time on this.
Tell everybody about that. So.
Hell yeah. Yeah. So maybe I'll start with Lift, because it's, I think, the easiest to understand, which is just a very basic principle, which is that capitalism is actively extracting itself from the physical layer at all times. That's really something it's really driven to do. And there's some economic reasons for that, principally because that physical layer is where price becomes most determined. Price is most determined by things like, let's say, cost of goods sold, so profit margins, things like that. So if you're working with physical objects, you're incredibly limited in your ability to set price because you have to spend some amount of money in order to construct something. And that amount of money is very market determined, complex, and is also very much kind of determined by real kind of physical problems on the world, like geopolitics, material resources, logistics, things like that. And it's also has the same problem on the consumer side, where once you actually are hitting a customer, once you're actually giving something to a customer in a single point of transaction, you foreclose the price of the thing that you're selling at to some level. And we really believe that capitalism is interested in getting wacky with price, that the fiction of price, the play with price is what is a kind of fundamental drive and interest in capitalism. I'm going to use words like drive and interest and tendency and things like that, which can sound very psychoanalytic, or they can sound very, they can sound like we're attributing some kind of subject position to capitalism. And we don't believe that that's the case. Like, instead, we're really kind of talking about a kind of formal logic or kind of algorithmic logic where there does exist some kind of tendency simply through the kind of algorithmic play. So the lift in its like most basic terms we talked about this in the big lecture, but there's this idea, which you guys also referenced through Land, but there's an idea that also David Graeber, I think, really kills, which is the idea that those barter societies that we love to fetishize, that we love to like say like those people got it right. They were all living in a village together, and someone was like really good at hunting, and someone was really good at gathering berries, and they just had this kind of informal relationship where whoever was good at this contributed this to the community and was therefore kind of rewarded with continuous existence within that community. And Graeber says, no, actually, barter systems only existed after some loose idea of the respective exchange value of those goods or services or tasks or whatever, that you had currency. You had some idea of currency prior to all of those things. And so lift for us, the most elemental transaction of lift is that Marxian transformation from some material good, some material service, whatever, something physical to its representation through a token, through a coin, through some currency position, through its exchange value. So that is one type of lift where you've moved from dealing with physical concrete things to dealing with abstract systems of exchange relativization. It's virtual. Coin space is virtual. The all kind of currency space is virtual. It's not physical. It's not tangible in that way. It's ultimately a kind of virtual software-like space. And then lift kind of cascades upwards, where as soon as, let's say, you have one tribe with one currency system that engages with another tribe with another currency system, you then have to build a kind of meta market that allows both of those currency spaces to coexist. So then you build, there's another type of lift that occurs there, where these two systems of internal exchange value are then given their respective exchange value positions that have to be mediated. And that's where things start to get really weird. From there, we believe that you can follow that logic all the way to things like high frequency trading, or now, AI agent driven, autonomous agent exchanges, which I think is really interesting. So lift is the idea that capital doesn't want anything to do with humans, which is a very controversial idea because a lot of people like to think about capital through the way that it affects humans. And capital certainly affects humans. Absolutely, we don't reject that whatsoever, and it affects humans often in very negative ways. But if you only examine capital through the lens of its effect on your own existence, you're incredibly limited in your ability to predict it. You're stuck in a kind of entirely reactive mode. So lift is one of these first kind of algorithmic principles that we lay out. We talk about things being very lifted. Lifted meaning there are more and more layers of abstraction that are interjected within a process. So an example that we give, for example, is OnlyFans, and the way that the OnlyFans economy evolved over time. And how pornography evolved over time as well, where let's say you went from the exchange of physical media, and there were physical agencies, there were logistics companies, like it was a very kind of physical product that was being disseminated. You moved towards a kind of ad revenue driven model. Once you came to the internet, you were able essentially to, put some kind of visual media on some platform and monetize it in a very meager way through ad share. And then you move towards a kind of as a service model, which is OnlyFans, where you're essentially paying a continuous subscription to individual producers of content. And that becomes very lifted once you realize that actually doing that in a sole proprietorship model is really complex. And it's really much more lucrative when you start to actually think about managing things. So instead of actually doing the thing, it's much, much better under capitalism to provide a management service through which other people do the thing. And ultimately, it's even better to provide a meta management service where you're managing managers of people who ultimately do the thing. And that's the lift process. You kind of build these kind of management layers. We talk about this through a variety of different ways as well. But the idea being as many kind of abstraction layers that you place between the thing that you're ultimately, the way that you're making money and actual commodity production or service generation, whatever, the more layers, abstract layers that exist between, the more lifted we call the organization that you're working with. Bro, do you want to add anything to lift that was...
Well, I think that maybe it's good to understand this as part of a sort of trilogy of concepts, which is lift, fold, and drag. And there is a collective concept that is very important, I think, that I think we take as a sort of driving force when we explain what's going on, which is abstraction, and how that relates to the fold process. in a two-way direction. One of those is lift, and that has to do with abstraction, and the other one is drag, which would be, I think, the second concept that you could introduce to kind of reframe what lift actually means. And with drag, the concept, the idea is that as humans, we attempt to embed ourselves into this process of lift, this sort of engagement with abstraction. This becomes a sort of performative, game. It's an impossible attempt to be part of something that is completely alien to ourselves. With the idea that by mimicking it to the extent that we become almost the same, you may be able to replace the map with the territory. We want to be that thing. And the funny thing about drag, the way we frame it, is that, and you can look at it through the idea of the state structure, bureaucracy as a kind of mechanic attempt at imitating these processes of abstraction, the idea of extending the amount of surface that we are exposing to exocapitalism so that we can attach to it as much as possible. But in that attempt to actually slow it down, our argument is that we're actually accelerating the departure in a way. And that's where the kind of sadness of this performative action that we're putting into place comes in. And that's something that links as well to a criticism that we introduced to the kind of Westphalian idea of the state and so on. So these two concepts, drag and lift, are two opposed forces, if you want, that work through that sort of underpinning mechanism of folds, the idea that you can modify something without transforming its kind of material essence, if you want, its underpinning essence. And that's how both mechanisms relate to each other.
Another way to think of it is lift is the idea that capital doesn't want anything to do with humans, and drag is the idea that humans want very much something to do with capital, right? And there is this kind of weird cat and mouse game as we kind of follow capital up, but it also shakes quite a few of us loose every time it ascends. Yeah.
So there's a couple things. So one, we haven't used the term here, but is this tendency, I would almost call lift inverted gravity. So instead of the tendency to bring things down to the earth, it's pulling them up into the sky.
Or into the virtual,
yeah. And so, but it seems, like you say, it adds layer and layer. So I'm going to use the term, there seems to be a kind of acceleration baked into this, right? And if there is an accelerationism in your thought, I think it's in this tendency, this inverted gravity of lift. And so drag seems to be like, well, it would be deceleration. But your guys' point is oftentimes the deceleration is acceleration, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like an example that we give in the book of drag, because there's also like this performative, like we're using drag in a variety of different senses here. But I think about like a marketing organization within a business. It's really, really difficult as someone who works in marketing to justify the way in which your job is ultimately producing revenue for the company, because what you're ultimately doing is you're producing advertisements, right? You're generating content, you're elevating brand awareness, but the actual correlation between the activities that you're doing and the business actually making money is really dilated in terms of time. It takes a long time for these efforts ultimately to make their way through, and it's very abstracted. Like, who knows what this or that marketing exercise ultimately led to, the business ultimately making more money. And so because of this problem, because marketing is already a kind of marketing as a kind of idea is already quite lifted from any kind of material production, and because ultimately the businesses that they're connecting themselves to are also very much limited from production, you need to kind of make those two things work. You need to kind of like intervene in some way as a human in order to sustain your existence as someone who works in marketing, for example. And so you build a new category of job like marketing operations, whose the entire job is around constructing fictional relationships through data magic to ultimately correlate those marketing activities to revenue generation activities. And so you build this kind of complex, fractal-like, almost kind of tumescent structure that's existing within an organization that has no real other function other than to justify the relationship between marketing and revenue. And then this gets even so. A company that we love to talk about a lot is Salesforce, which I think is the most beautiful company that exists. I think it's incredibly gorgeous. It's a platform that does customer resource management. You could talk about that in the most abstract way, but it's basically a very special kind of database, and it's very hard to manage. It's also usually held as like a kind of source of truth within a company. So everyone has to loosely agree that what's in Salesforce is correct. But at the same time, it's very difficult to actually change or alter anything that's in Salesforce because of the UX, because of the way that it's constructed. And so it creates this interesting tension where the things have to be correct in Salesforce in order for the business to continue to kind of legitimate itself as such. But it's very difficult to keep those things correct due to the way that this actual software is being instrumented. And that's ultimately to produce a type of job called a Salesforce administrator, whose entire position is around being able to correlate, being able to make the kind of portal of Salesforce open to people who want to modify it. But it's an incredibly niche position. Almost every job out there, especially in tech, but also most sectors, has at least one or more Salesforce administrators. And this entire job is essentially constructed on the difficulty of negotiating the reality of the underlying situation, which is that like you have all these fictions that are being spouted and you need a kind of like fiction manager or a kind of fiction overseer, right? And so it's really beautiful. And so like these jobs like marketing operation or Salesforce administration are what we call drag, which is an attempt for the human to kind of locate a position for itself within this unspooling structure that these jobs are literally about justifying one's own right to play, one's own right to have a job within this position that's ultimately increasingly decorrelated from any kind of human activity. So it's like these beautiful interventions of the human into organizational structures, which is at the same time incredibly lifted because marketing operations and Salesforce administration both have like they're incredibly weird abstract things. Like they don't, it's like it doesn't make sense. Like it really
they're not set up to like, oh, we're gonna satisfy some core human need.
No, exactly. 100%. 100%. So that's kind of what I mean is that like the human is trying to intervene. Like they see a business that's gradually lifting. They intervene. They're like, okay, I'm going to create a job of like essentially fiction manager within the kind of price mechanics of a lifting organization in order to so that I can continue to extract my wage from this particular position, but at the same time I'm going to contribute to the sustainability of this lifting process and therefore accelerate it.
There is something there as well, I think. Sorry, you said.
No, it's the ultimate pick me behavior.
Totally. Yeah.
Managerialization. There's something there. Going back to the idea of acceleration. So we I think at one point in the book we say exocapitalism is about a transscalar encounter with capitalism. What happens there is that the idea of causality breaks down. Causality, we are very much embedded into this, and Marek knows that I'm going to use this term, Wiki's vision of this. We are obsessed with linear narratives. We want cause and effect. That's how we work. That's how we perceive. That's how we've been designed. We're apophenic cognizance. We get noise. We make patterns. So there's all of that. And I think with the idea of acceleration, I think there is something that is important, I think, from our point of view, is that the time scales of capitalism are different to ours. So acceleration, in a way, doesn't really make sense. It may or may not be acceleration. From the human perspective, it may look like it, but the folding processes move on a different time scale. So our perspective on that remains very much like human-centered. What we perceive as acceleration may not be acceleration on a different time scale, let's put it that way. Once the kind of chain of causality is broken and the possibility of action and reaction becomes a bit more problematic, I think.
So you would say maybe that acceleration has to be thought in terms of phenomenology, the phenomenological experience of the human.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. From our scale, from our position, we see something that's accelerating. And that's where like the critique of accelerationism as a kind of political strategy or economic strategy to us becomes really complicated. Like we're definitely, we grew up like within the left accelerationist scene, very much beholden to a lot of those thinkers. Yeah. But then there's this question, which I feel like nobody has an answer to, which is like, okay, so we've accelerated this thing to a point where it's departed or disappeared or collapsed. Why wouldn't it come back? Like that's really a fundamental question for us is like, why wouldn't it come back? Like, especially if for us, it's embedded within the symbolic, it's embedded within language, it's embedded in, some kind of transcendental plane. But even without that framework, I still think that that's like a glaring lacuna is like, why wouldn't it come back if it's if it's a kind of system. And that's the problem if you only see history through this kind of specifically Marxian lens, where everything is ultimately moving in a direction. There is a kind of everything is kind of determined very, very much by its immediate social construction. Like, then you can find yourself in a position where you're like, yeah, this thing falls apart, and then a new order manifests, and that new order is good and better, and we live within that new order now. And it's like, no, I mean, like, why would it not come back? Absolutely, it'll come back. And then the left accelerationist position, which I find the most problematic, and here I'm like very interested in folks like Helen Hester, for example, the kind of like and in that the book on, I forget what it's called. There's a book on essentially like the automation of the human female reproductive object as a whole, like as this question, like that's become a thing that's been talked about quite a bit. Sarah Elsie Baker also over the past like 10, 15 years is like, can we get to a position where maybe through the acceleration, through a kind of greater coupling between leftist projects and technology, that we find ourselves at a place where we achieve a kind of luxury gay space communism, right? Where we get to a place where actually all of our needs are taken care of and we can thrive by leaning in a little bit, and especially on the technological side. And that's, for us, the counter argument there is lift, which is that no, like if you lean into a thing that's lifting away from any kind of intervention, any kind of interest, or any kind of optimization, or any kind of utilitarian ethos towards human pain and suffering, like it doesn't care. Like, it's not interested in that stuff. It doesn't want to help you with that stuff. You can lean in and you're going to find yourself, getting involved in, high frequency trading and all kinds of automated financial schemes, but you're not going to find a lot of development in on the actual human layer itself. You're not going to automate the womb. You're not going to automate, some kind of mass relationship to human food production in a way that's ultimately ethical and sustainable and ecologically neutral. Like, you're not going to find that. And even that, like, when everyone, shows all the robots that are coming from China, and Nvidia does this big announcement about robotics and whatever, where is it? Like, where is it? Like, it's that's not actually the thing. Like, that's not actually what capitalism is interested in producing, precisely because of what we enumerate in Lift. Those are hard to manage things, weird to price things. Yeah.
So, like,
they're yeah.
No, I think this is also a point where you would have a disagreement with Nick, because Nick seems to think that what capitalism, or what capital fundamentally wants to do, is produce new robotics.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems like you guys are saying, no, it's not interested in robotics. It's just the software component.
I mean, this is where we're coming at land a little bit for being like, come on, bro. Like, the tech world is reading the shit out of you. You should spend more time in the tech world, because like that isn't there. Like, it really isn't. Robotics, that is entirely a 90s science fiction view of the future. We're beyond that now. Like, yeah, there's still like lots of advertisement and speculative fundraising, let's say geared against Nvidia and their interest in providing, edge AI solutions or robotic solutions, things like that. But those are fundraising exercise ultimately. That's marketing. That's like you're reading the marketing and interpreting that.
So
as
they
the
do that
real
so
strategy.
they can fund their software development.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Nvidia, at the end of the day, is a software company, right? I mean, that's fundamentally what they produce, and a software management company.
So look, like what I've argued, and this is like me approaching it from the Lacanian Zizekian perspective, where capital gets its hooks in us is in the fantasies it sells us. And in a sense, like, they're doing this thing with robotics to get, funding, blah, blah, blah. How do we stay hooked on capital? It's because, we're going to get our robot bodies. It's Kurzweil, right? We're going to be able to transcend our biology. We're going to be able to have the phantasmatic sex lives realized, right? It's all of this kind of stuff at the level of fantasy. And the fantasy is, robotics are going to kick in and give us the bodies we want, give us the abilities we want. And so would this be a point? I know, there's this question of where does ideology fit in to exocapitalism, but would you say that maybe this is a point where ideology has a role to play here, because it's giving us fantasies which are not it's never going to actually realize, but it's given us these fantasies of this robotic future that keeps us libidinally invested. Maybe this is a type of ideological drag.
It could be, yeah, I think so. I mean, like I think we don't create a lot of space for ideology within exocapitalism because, like, for us, I mean, certainly I mean, our theory of ideology is functionally drag. So you could argue maybe that, ideology is one of those mechanics through which one of those reasons or one of those drives or one of those forcing functions that continues to collect the human onto capitalism or forces the human to embed itself onto that surface. Ultimately, the way that we think about it is that, like, we believe it's self-evident to everybody that capitalism is lifting away, and that it's like we totally believe that's self-evident, and in so doing, it's creating obviously problems that we see with things like class everywhere, which is this rising disjunction between incredibly well-paid individuals and people who are bubbling within precarity. And ultimately, we think that the clear and visible fall off from that first economic structure, which is this glittering, radiant structure that's largely software driven, moving its way, cascading into the kind of virtual plane, and then like hard slave feudal realism. That drop off is really extreme and very visible to a lot of people. And ultimately, we think that that's like why so many humans are invested in ultimately kind of moving their way into that former mode of organization. There's certainly a lot more nuance that can be applied there, but we're not like trained enough in psychoanalytical theory or anything like that in order to really kind of break that down. I do think that like I'm not sure that the robotic fantasy, I mean, the way that the robotic fantasy ultimately, I think, is being mobilized here has a lot to do, it's complicated because it's speaking to VCs in a lot of ways. It's like a kind of appeal to the market as a whole in a really interesting way. Like it's like I don't think NVIDIA cares about public sentiment at any kind of scale. Like that seems very odd to me. Instead, but they do care about the way in which a kind of logic or rhetoric could be framed that makes it kind of plausible that NVIDIA is a hardware company. Because like if NVIDIA was actually apprehended for what it is, which is, I mean, an incredibly complex financial vehicle. I mean, absolutely just a financial vehicle. If it was apprehended that way, it would actually create a lot of problems, at least in terms of the way that we've been able to create and sustain markets. And those aren't problems for capitalism. Those aren't problems for markets. Those are problems for NVIDIA, right? And so that's something that NVIDIA is trying to kind of mobilize, which is like this grand, massively scaled pretense that it is something other than a financial organization, than a kind of FinServ company. But that's the way that works, I think, is complicated. I'm not sure that I'm really kind of capable of speaking through that. I'm sure there is some kind of psychoanalytical element to there because, like, certainly sentiment has something to do with whether or not you're able to kind of continue to expand your market cap based on pretending to be something that you aren't. But that being said, I do think that most of that market cap is sustained by people who do very well absolutely know what NVIDIA is. One of those people being Sam Altman and OpenAI in general. Another one of those organizations being Oracle. Like, those organizations fundamentally understand what NVIDIA is, and they're able to kind of bypass or I think they're ultimately actively disinterested in that veneer. They understand what NVIDIA is, so they can sustain that investment. But at the same time, it does feel like, to your point, that NVIDIA is interested in pretending that it's doing robotics, at least when it comes to
like,
public
on
marketing.
a public relations level. Like, okay, if Lyft truly doesn't care about the human, fine, I can accept that. What these corporations won't do is just come out and say, hey, we don't care about anything human. We don't care about making your lives any better. That's not a concern of ours. We are only interested in the abstract greater pursuit of profits. You mean nothing. The human means nothing. Why can't they just say it? There's some thing where they would like resist actually coming straight out and just being honest about it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do think that a company like Jane Street, for example, would be very happy to say that, right? Like, really? I do think that Palantir would be pretty happy to say that too, right? Like, I think it depends. Like, it depends on how you're trying to ultimately kind of position yourself within a variety of different frameworks simultaneously. I would say that that would be only a value that would only decrease value, right? Like, there's no way that saying that would increase value. So why would you say that? You know, like, instead, it feels reasonable to invest in a couple millions of dollars, which is totally arbitrary and meaningless to organizations like this anyway, to do some basic public relations.
But then there is some tentacle of the human actually attached a little bit, where they're still having to placate us, so to speak.
I think,
Yeah.
Michael, the question there has to do more with drag than anything else, not with lifts. Even when we talk about this is all part of the same game. It's just an attempt to embed ourselves into something. So I would think of ideology as something that relates directly to the drag space, to the mid space. And everything that companies do, in a way, fits itself into that. These companies remain tethered, if you want, to the human dimension of things. We discussed an example in the talk that we had in Berlin a while ago. We talk about, like, Meta, for example. We do talk about WeChat. But I think there's another question here that is also problematic, is confounding technology and capital, which is something that we find a lot when we discuss the book with people. People say technology is something developed by capital in order to X. And the argument that we usually raise is that technology is not that. We are technological entities. We've engaged with technology since, we kind of emerged as a species. An externalization of action beyond the flesh, beyond the body, from the most kind of basic interactions with the environment. You just get, some mud and paint on a wall. That's a technological engagement with reality, to ideas of social cognition, distributed cognition that we have nowadays. And I think equating technology and capital it's sometimes part of the problem. Yeah.
So, but it like, whether we want to call it ideology or whether we just want to call it cope, that's a dimension of drag. Like, it's not all that drag is, but where this human ability, like the human sense of we're trying to cope with lift. That's where this dimension of ideology or falsification, however we want to talk about it, comes into.
Yeah. But that's coming from the human. I think that's the argument that we're trying to make. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Capital itself doesn't care. It's
yeah.
And so, especially, you have a capitalist, and it's a unique thing, right? Because the capitalist is the one who's trying to be aligned to the logic of lift, while still having this human component to them, maybe against their own will. But nonetheless, the capitalists, the board of directors, they're the ones who are stuck in this almost liminal space between lift and just wanting to serve lift, and then having to deal with us humans.
Yeah, it's unbelievably complex. I think, like, a question that we get asked very often, especially in Europe, is like, people are making these decisions, though, Marek. Like, at the end of the day, like, there's someone in a boardroom who's making a decision to do lift, right? Like, there is that element. So there are people involved. So you have to really think about those people and their ultimate drives and the way that they function. And, like, I'm not denying that. Like, definitely there are people involved. But I mean, those people are absolutely 1000% first operating as the output of a series of spreadsheets, right? I mean, like, that is absolutely what is happening. Like, the decisions that are being made, if someone is ultimately, like, let's say, good at these particular positions in a way that will allow the business to continue to survive, like, they are absolutely listening to data that is showing them that certain actions are better than others, and that data has very much a lot to do with the market. And yes, of course, there are extreme situations where decision makers have been in place that have made wild and crazy decisions. Like, Steve Jobs would be a kind of iconic example of this. Like, someone who was, like, incredibly good at decisions, let's say, in terms of building a company and associating his personal brand with the success of that company. But ultimately, what we're speaking to is not Steve Jobs's decisional capabilities, but rather the fact that this particular company was constructed itself into inflections within capital that allowed it to ultimately become the thing that it did. And at the same time, very many other decisions were happening by other individuals with a similar degree of rapacious intensity and freewheelingness and creativity that did not succeed, right? Like,
Right.
and that ultimately what is letting things succeed is the degree to which they've been able to anticipate and ride the flows of capital.
So here, let me give you an example here that Nance and I use in we wrote a piece that was published at Everyday Analysis, and it was called Enjoy Your Surveillance. And what we like, okay, so this decision on that distribution companies make, delivery companies make. Okay, do we put AI surveillance cameras into the cab of the delivery vehicle or not? Well, is it really the capitalists making the decision? Is it the managers? No, because you can have a situation where none of the workers want these cameras in the delivery vehicles. None of the managers want them. And even the capitalists themselves don't want them. But you get such lower insurance rates that capital itself makes the decision.
Exactly. The insurance companies want them. 100%. Yes, exactly. 100%. Oh my God. So many things are insurance driven. 100%. I mean, I spend a lot of time working in IoT, for example, Internet of Things, which is an approach to embedding, precisely as you say, like digital interventions into spaces that are otherwise quite physical. So, you have small computers that are on the edge, be it providing cameras that are doing surveillance in a variety of different locations, or automating factories, or automating farms, things like that. And if you trace that revenue stream all the way to the last instance, in almost all cases, it boils down to insurance. 100%. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
But it's this case where the capitalist who owns the trucking company, the capitalist could hate this idea. And so, yeah, it's this important moment where it's like, no, you see this distinction clear as day between capitalist and capital in that situation. Okay, so I still want to say about Lyft. I love this example you guys actually use in the book about the hotel. And so, look, a hotel starts, and it's a very basic product it's selling, which is it's satisfying a human concrete need. Hey, you're out of town. You need a place to sleep. Here, we will rent you. You can rent a room. Great. Okay. Problem is, how do you maximize profit in that situation? Well, you're very limited based on the amount of rooms. You can only have so many guests at once. So how does the company go about making more money? It has to lift. It has to go into these abstract things. And so you list these different things. But I mean, you see this, join this rewards program, download the app, blah, 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 right? And so you start to see these little businesses within the business that just keep going up, more and more detached from human needs, human satisfaction. And so, hold on, Nance, talk about your example that you just had, where it blends Lyft with, our work on superego.
Yeah, so it was very amusing to me. One of my kids works at a pizza shop, just kind of up the road from me, and it's I know the guy that runs it. It's a brick and mortar. It's a real concrete company, and it sells pizza, and they deliver pizza, and they satisfy me when I want pizza, and it's my kid's high school job, and it's a real thing in my life. We called, I think it was last night. Was it last night, Mikey?
Yeah.
Or 2 days ago?
It was 2 nights ago.
Yeah, 2 nights ago, we called to place an order like we normally do when she's at work, because we like to go pick it up and embarrass her. And we dial the phone number, and rather than getting her answering the phone and us like playing a joke, haha, we get an automated system, and it sounds like a pharmaceutical advertisement. And I mean, in America, we have like this upbeat, cheery, chipper music, and it's like, hey, how are you today? It's this automated voice, and it's like, what are you doing? Calling to order a pizza. People don't do that anymore. Download our app, and you can order anytime you want. And it's very super egoic. And that was the first thing that jumped out at me. Like, oh, this is super egoic. But then I was like, this is trying to get me to download an app to order a pizza, so I no longer interface with my kid and these people that I know, but rather I'm interfacing with this cloud system that's collecting data and generating data. And it was just so stark to me that this is Lyft, and it's very demonic. It's very like it felt very gross, and I think that's the super egoic side of it. But
not
also
only do you have to lift, you have to enjoy it.
You have to enjoy lifting.
Yeah, exactly. Damn,
So,
that's so sad.
But no,
I love calling pizza places. Yeah, totally.
But I mean, that has to do as well with something that I think we haven't discussed. I don't know if you wanted to go into that, which is the idea of volatility.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. That we were, because we start the book by looking at this idea of the possibility of a translation between different worlds. And we define a cosmology in a very kind of broad sense. And what happens when these translations actually take place, that relates to the idea of arbitrage and the arbitrage and so on. And the idea is that that's when volatility is actually injected. And that's what makes capitalism thrive. And in a way, the book presents a reframing of the idea of labor from the Marxist perspective, which is the injection of value, add value, into the idea of injection of volatility. The criticism being that labor itself injects a very small amount of volatility, so it can only work as a starting point. So what your kid is doing at the pizza place, it's not doing it. So we move into the next layer, and then into the next layer, until it becomes, it starts moving at a speed that is completely impossible for us to understand. It becomes non-human in a way.
Mm-hmm.
This also relates to the concept of surface area, which is what gets us into concepts like fold, and that like there are a number of things that happen within a pizza business. There's obviously supplier relationships when it comes to the physical construction of the thing, right? There's someone who actually has to make the pizza. But then to your point, there's also the kind of phone call ordering situation. There's the administration of the pizza restaurant. There's the licensing of the pizza restaurant's brand. There's the payment processing of the buying the pizza, right? And there's probably infinite other kind of little nodes you can place some kind of fractal growth within, but there's a lot of opportunities that you can inject some other kind of layers to interfere in, through which to generate more capital. And so like a major concept of the book is that this is the type of monopoly structure that we have today, which is a very different type of monopoly structure than we think we have. So when we think about someone like Yanis Varoufakis's techno-feudalist concept, or even Nick Cernacek's and Alex Williams's platform capitalism, I think that was just Nick Cernacek actually, but these ideas, like there's a sense that there are these companies right now, like Amazon, for example, who are hyper monopolies. Their whole function is to totally consolidate and vertically integrate with the entire world. There's this idea that Amazon wants to be the entire world, in that they want to own the entire logistics chain, from producing the good, getting the good to their warehouse, using robots to move the good around, ultimately bring the good to you. They're going to own the payment structure. They're going to own the kind of marketplace structure, working with other brands, whatever. They're going to own every individual component of that, and they're also going to administrate all of those paths, and that's how they're going to make money, according to the kind of conventional capitalist analysis. Through that process of vertical integration, they're going to be able to extract as much surplus value out of it through efficiency, optimization, whatever. And that's the thing that makes Amazon so special. And the type of monopoly that we describe is very different to that, which is a monopoly that has essentially a kind of infinite amount of surface area, where, like this kind of pizza business, there are all these openings where other businesses can kind of nest themselves within. So like in a case of a payment processor, you might have you might partner with someone who'll provide you with the actual terminal, and they'll probably do that on a kind of subscription basis. Maybe there's going to be a software company that's going to provide the interface for that terminal. There's also going to be, you might partner with Stripe, for example, for payment processing. So a software company that's going to handle all of that. There's going to be a SIM card provider, whatever, that's going to handle the kind of telematics of making sure that you can get this information wirelessly without some kind of Wi-Fi connection. Then there's probably going to be some kind of customer management solution where you can get some sort of sense of who's buying from you the pizza and create a kind of identity for them, a profile that you can send advertisements to and mailers to and things like that. And so you can build this kind of, just out of like that one point of payment processing, you can have all of these partnerships and arrays of different relationships that might involve you paying money to people, but might also involve people paying money to you. You can have this kind of circuitous flow of capital around each of these nodes. And so this is what we call the fold, which is that like just from the kind of imminent flows of pizza, of being a pizza business, you create all of these like opportunities for growth that just come from taking the doughy elastic structure of the business itself and knotting it and adding more kind of places for other businesses to nest themselves into.
Yeah.
So when you go back to, yeah, please.
Sorry, Mark. No, please.
No, please.
No, it's this idea of moving from a B2C model business to consumer model, which is you and your kid, and the idea of avoiding the C at all costs and moving into an endless chain of B2B to B2B to B2B to B2C. So, as an example of Lyft, I'm sure the pizza place got a call from a third-party company saying, "Hey, you want to increase your sales by 50%? People can get synchronous orders. They're going to be super happy. We can track when they call. We can make it work." And I'm sure that they didn't hire anyone else. So what this is doing is translating into a complete indifference into the working conditions probably of your kid, who's working 50% extra because now no one is answering the phone and someone got fired and everything has kind of shifted into yeah.
Okay, I want to a little bit more on the theory. I actually conveniently have it right here. Okay, so how much did this influence you guys? Can you see it?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. That's I think my favorite. Like, I mean, obviously, Anti-Oedipus is my favorite from the both, and The Fold is I think my favorite from Deleuze. Yeah, it's great.
So that's a
great.
direct influence on your
direct
concept
influence,
of Fold.
100%, because we are interested in thinking of capital. I mean, we think of capital as transcendental, right? Like we do think that it has its own kind of logic, it exists in its own plane, but the way that it moves and structures things around it is ultimately very much immanent to its own internal patterning. So you just kind of recursively apply the patterns of capital to itself, and that's how you ultimately get these weird interventions into the space of the human. So yeah, it's very much interested in a kind of monadistic concept of capital, but a huge capital monad that all of us humans are in the process of gradually discovering.
Okay, so I think we've touched on every one of the core concepts except the last mile. So let's talk about that, and then we'll go into some other directions.
Well, we talked about the last mile and the concept of talking about that slave economy, that feudal economy. So ultimately, there's this sense of like people love to remind us that at the end of the day, those data centers have computers in them, and those computers in them have neodymium that's been mined in this particular part of China or Central Africa. So, there's labor there. Or like at the end of the day, like, this particular bank sells T-shirts as part of its marketing operations, and those T-shirts come from fibers that are then spun by workers that work in sweatshops in this particular part of Bangladesh. So come on, like there's labor, and it's like true, like 100%, like we're not denying that at all. But we do believe that the conditions on the ground where those types of operations are occurring are very, very much removed from the actual dynamics of capital itself. We were talking about this before, in principle, because a lot of these operations have very much to do with human social reproduction. Definitely. And what is interesting is that what happens you get a kind of like weird kind of curve like this, where things that are happening on the ground tend to expand more and more, tend to actually operate on smaller and smaller scales. They tend to be more interpenetrated across broader society. There's a different type of motion to the last mile. And then you have this incredibly abstract logistics chain. This is something Mackenzie Wark describes really beautifully through the concept of vectorialization, where you don't have one supply chain. You have a huge filigree thin web of supply opportunities. And that web is so complex that once it actually hits the lifting underbelly of capital, you have no idea what actually transpired in order to get it there. I think like one of my favorite examples from the book is this example of the Apigee like tea organization. So there was a sweatshop that had a lot of problems with it. That sweatshop was called out because it was producing tea that was being sold in England as associated with this one particular brand. And the kind of thing that was so crazy and weird about this was that the brand claimed that it had no real awareness, that it was really impossible for it to actually determine where the tea had come from. Like it was not really possible. It was just one of its many, many suppliers. And there's so many different chains of oversight and administration and whatever that go between that company that's selling the tea and where the tea is actually coming from, that they can't be responsible for those on the ground conditions because it's too abstract. They don't even know. And they could just move to another tea provider like that as soon as it became problematic. And also, there's a lift process on the inside of that where you have all these companies whose entire function is to essentially sell the idea of supply chain oversight. So you can basically go to someone who's going to rubber stamp the ethical nature of your supply chain, and they rubber stamp it, they kind of certify it, but they also don't actually know who the full underlying mechanics of it is. Basically a service that you pay in order to kind of add a rubber stamp to what you're doing, essentially. So there's this filigree thin web which connects the lifting underbelly of capital to what's actually happening on the ground in terms of material production, we do believe that these are organized by different mechanics and have different interests. This web is very fungible. You can just move through the web. If one tether goes down, you can pivot to something else or pivot to another type of business entirely. It really doesn't matter. And because at the end of the day, we do believe that everything that's moving within the kind of grand shepherd tone of lift that's occurring at the top in capital is ultimately tending towards financial services, which only really limits to a dependency on the ground in the most abstract possible way. So the biggest example that we love to share about this is high frequency trading, where essentially you have at scale bets being made not on physical assets, not on stocks really, on bundles of different stocks and assets and derivatives, whatever, together, and they're being made for 200 milliseconds at a time. So there's no investment or interest in the actual in any kind of growth that's associated with production, with a company doing better over any kind of palpable timescale. It's not interested in the actual business mechanics itself. It's only interested in the kind of stochastic motion of volatility in that price. And because you can use math to look at a random number chart and ultimately make a determination about whether or not it's likely that graph is going to go up or go down, you can choose to either either invest or take a short position in that particular dynamic, and just do it very quickly and fire it over and over again until you ultimately make a profit at some kind of scale. And so to us, that's an incredibly lifted dynamic in that it is very much lifted from the material conditions that ultimately theoretically inform in some kind of really hard to define aggregate that turbulent motion that leads to someone ultimately making money from that exchange. But you can't take it apart. It doesn't make sense to take it apart. And if you analyze that motion through, this let's say Citadel made an investment in this particular ETF, which is composed of these particular stocks, and at this moment, this particular business made this one decision that was advantageous to this market perception that ultimately was maybe opinion to the cost of this underlying good. If you do that, you lose the picture. You lose an understanding of the actual mechanic of what's occurring, which is the high frequency trading situation. Yeah. So that's the last mile is what's happening down here, and it's very difficult. We love to read capital through this, but it's much more productive, we think, to read these as different systems.
Okay, so I think now I want to kind of broaden out the conversation. And I think, because Nance, I know where you want to take this. So you want to go Bataille, you want to go energetics, you want to go value. Let me ask, I got a couple questions here, and I think it leads into that. So I kind of want to set this up. And I think what would be really helpful here is to kind of zoom out. And I think it's helpful to just kind of ask you guys point blank. Okay, so capitalism is a software economy. Let's talk about some of this stuff though. What is software? What is an algorithm? Does computation necessitate computers?
Yeah, we'd say I don't know how she would feel about us continuously referencing her because we think she's the most amazing thinker right now, but also we wrote a very controversial book, so we're like, I mean, like we're not blaming her for any of these insights, but she's been incredibly influential to us. That's M. Beatrice Fazzi, and also Luciana Parisi here in a sense. Like there's a emerging awareness to a consensus largely within the scientific community that computation is not something that is socially constructed, but rather something that is, for the most part, internal to itself, right? Computation is a thing that exists. It doesn't exist in the sense that it's not like something that we are making. We're rather discovering it. It is a kind of patterning to things. A lot of people argue that it is a kind of fundamental underpinning through the patterning of everything. I don't think we're not there. I don't think Fazzi is there either, but some people make that argument.
Almost like Mayasu's RK fossil, was that the product of computation?
Yeah, I mean, I think someone like Blaise Aguera, Yarkis, and Catherine Hales might argue, yes, absolutely. Like that is one type of computation kind of moving its way through that we are just kind of we're step number trillion on the pathway of this computational process. Fair. I don't know. I mean, then we can get really wacky with that. But I think at very least we understand computation through a series of axiomatic processes, through algorithms fundamentally as their kind of like core unit. And we also understand that you can do computation on anything. That computation does not require computers. Very, very, very definitely doesn't require computers, or at least it doesn't require, let's say, the type of computers that we understand as computers. First of all, it doesn't require computers because it doesn't need to be actualized, right? Like you don't need to actualize computation for computation to exist. Yeah. But at the same time, you can also engage a computer that's made out of anything to do computation. The real thing that we always want to shout against is there is a argument from is it Guattari that there is a kind of like silicon component to computation, that silicon has a voice in computation, that there's like an underlying material voice inside computation that's powered by silicon or by rocks or by mineral intelligence, something like this. And we dispute that because the usage of silicon for computation is arbitrary. It is advantageous in its ability to function for superconductance at some kind of scale, so you can do a certain number of processing units, whatever. But like you could do computation on water. And actually, I've been reading a lot of papers about how like you should be doing computation on water, or you could be doing computation like I love Laura Tripaldi's argument about this, like looking at computation done on slime molds, for example, like how you can do computation by producing some initial conditions to a slime mold and having them ultimately move towards the realization of those calculations. So yeah, that's why we see there being a kind of kinship between computation and capitalism, in that we think of them both as part of some class of things that first of all, don't need to be actualized in order to be real. They exist, right? You don't need to actually do them in order to have them. They don't need to be constructed. They're also things that are discovered over time, as opposed to invented. So we don't invent capitalism, we don't invent computation, we rather discover them. And third, there is this independence from some material coupling. There's, at least as we currently understand it, there's an independence of computation from any kind of formal physical mechanics. We also see the same with capitalism.
And that's, I think, what's important here, because when we talk about software, for example, people think, well, that's something human beings sit down at computers and make, and they're not getting this broader, I'm going to use the term ontology of software, that for you guys, and correct me if I'm wrong, software exists in the universe prior to us showing up. And that is what I think is important to point out, because if somebody goes into it and they have the mindset of, oh, software is something humans make, they're not going to get what you guys are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like anyone who thinks that everything is socially constructed, we're already going to be immediately at odds with each other. Because first of all, I mean, you referenced Mayasu's archifossil. Mayasu, very complicated person who's getting called out a lot right now for not doing math very well. But that archifossil problem is a really, really fundamental problem to a lot of people. Right. Because if we invent science, then how on earth do you explain geology that exists prior to humans, right? If we invent the laws of nature, if we've constructed the laws of nature according to either Western cis heteropatriarchal values, if we read it through systems that are fundamentally wrapped in problematic social organizations, or if we just read it as an arbitrary thing that we are all doing in real time, how do you explain the fact that these laws do seem to pre-exist us considerably? We struggle with Meyasu when he argues that all those laws are also random and arbitrary. That gets a little complicated for us, but we do love the idea of the archifossil as this example of like, well, how do you explain that? Like, how do you explain the fact that things happen prior to humans if everything is socially constructed by humans?
Yeah, I think it's important for us. We've been working on this for a while through different concepts, differentiating what something is with the human engagement with that reality or with that entity or with that transcendental object. I think historically those two have been in many cases taken as an identical thing, and that generates a series of problems. We've been looking as well recently at the idea of language as something that has divorced itself from cognition. So the idea that language is a trait that defines human is being put to a test right now by LLMs and so on, through the work of Liv Weatherby and so on. And I think that all relates to that similar principle as Marek was pointing out, in the case of capitalism, in the case of computation, also in the case of language. It's a similar idea, a similar approach in all cases, I think.
Okay, so a couple things real quick. So, okay, is exocapitalism primarily descriptive or normative? You guys seem to be rather neutral towards capital, whereas I cannot be. I hate capital. I also appreciate it. It's a weird. It's complicated, but if you're asking me as a blue collar worker, if that's the position I'm talking from, yeah, not a huge fan. If you ask me philosophically, then it gets more complicated. But I guess that's the thing is, reading the book, it seems like you guys are just trying to be as descriptive and neutral as possible and not get into the normative stuff. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I think we close our lecture with like a very large collection of Solomonic demonic sigils, for example. So we have this like giant page from the Ars Goetia, which shows a variety of different names for demons, and we think it's really, really productive if we need to enter the kind of moral space, to work with a moral space where that involves a large number of things with divergent interests and capabilities and strengths, as opposed to what we do see very much in the left, which is there's exactly what Nick Land is describing, a kind of techno-capital singularity of evil. Like everything evil kind of condenses into one force, a force that contains not only technology, capitalism, computation, but also whiteness, for example, colonialism, gender-based discrimination, other modes of discrimination, everything bad, like absolutely everything bad, kind of condenses into a force of badness, and that force of badness is incredibly indistinct in its interiority. What you get is a sense that all of these things tend to move the same way. They tend to affect everything the same way, and the only way that we can move society forward is by destroying this black hole. I think it's really hard to destroy black holes, first of all, because they're black holes. And it does also seem that like every time you kind of shoot something at a black hole, it seems like the black hole gets bigger, right? Like that also does seem to be a tendency of black holes. But like if you truly do see the world as a kind of space, not you, but like, the broader kind of left, if the left sees the world as a space of dedifferentiated evil and dedifferentiated good, you're going to have a continuous and endless negotiation around what falls in each of these categories. So either this is good or this is bad. And you're just going to, it's like an incredibly superficial moral conflict. And that can be really useful. If this is something that's being mobilized strictly in terms of generating solidarity, I do think that enmity tends to bring people together more than constructive things, like for sure. But I mean, you're incredibly limited in terms of what you can achieve. If instead you'll understand the space of evil, or let's say moral complication, as something that's very dynamic with a variety of different actors within it, things get quite interesting. Because if you see capital as morally neutral, its applications certainly tend to be quite bad. But if you see it as morally neutral and as a series of instruments or as a series of algorithmic tendencies, it becomes quite possible to see it as something that you can use as a tool, or or destroy, right? Though I think it's very difficult to destroy. The same thing with all of these other kind of components that you could collapse into that singularity of evil. I think it's also like incredibly incorrect to think that all of these things act the same way. Like to think that, for example, capital and whiteness are two sides of the exact same coin, to me really doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, I mean, definitely thinking about a lot of like the problematics of whiteness, especially in the United States, tends to overlap in an incredibly uneasy and weird way with class positions, right? There's also like a sense on the left that actually the only people who like capitalism is like the West, right? Capitalism is like this symbol of the West, and it's only wealthy people who like capitalism. And that's like, that could not be less true. Like actually the most of the world is incredibly bought into the concept of capitalism, principally because there it does seem like there's only one way to move oneself up through the social hierarchy to live a better life for yourself, right? It does seem like a very kind of limited funnel. So what we're trying to propose is a much more dynamic space of evil, where you can understand how different forces may agree or disagree with each other, that might be both things that you consider evil. I think that makes the world a lot more actionable in terms of a space. But yeah, to your point, we're pretty neutral on everything just for the sake of descriptiveness.
And there is a question that comes usually after the talks that we've been given in Europe, and it usually relates to agency and the possibility of action. And the way we're trying to frame this is that, given our position and our understanding of capitalism as a sort of axiomatic logic that is internal to itself, and the idea that agency and action become irrelevant vis-a-vis capitalism, and that discourse has to be framed towards the human as a contained reality. The idea that capitalism in a way has also been used as a blurred, undefined category, as Marek is pointing out now, that we're fighting, but no one really truly attempts to define. The idea that revolutionary action can only be in a way understood retrospectively. You cannot plan revolution. No one has done that, I believe, and no one has managed to do it. No one has written a revolution in a book that has happened. Revolutions are thought, if they actually happen in some sort of way, if you want to frame things that way, are thought as after the fact. We look retrospectively and we say, actually, that was a change. So I think there's something there with regards to agency that is really important. No, it's difficult for us as workers, if you want to frame it that way, to accept that agency towards capital doesn't actually make sense, and to accept that the shift is necessary, but towards the human versus human relationships, which is something that we're actually ignoring by framing things. So this kind of abstraction of what capital may or may not be. Yeah.
Okay, so Nance, why don't you take it? You've got the bataille and the stuff on value, so
yeah, well, the bataille, I'm thinking about Heidegger right now, because just thinking about like distinguishing technology and capitalism and thinking about how these things are put into use, and I think that's super duper in this book, even though I don't think it's ever made explicit, but I think you guys are very much dealing with kind of interrogating how we disclose ourselves and our relationship to the world, and saying, hey, capital also has this method of disclosure. But the stuff with value, and talking about how capital has its own ideas. Fuck it, it's a stupid word to use, but ideas, it's a perfect word to use too, because like this idea of the general economy, capital is this machine. It is the solar anus. It is taking all our resources and kind of excreting by way of the last mile, by way of drag, like it's excreting waste but that's not what it's doing from its perspective. Like that's the screen that we see, and that becomes the surface that gets folded up and crumpled into little paper balls that justify history as such. But all along, capital has been doing its own accounting, and the like its ledger is this kind of computational. Computation is, it's a weird word to use for me, but I think like metabolic activity, like it kind of becomes synonymous. Like it's this autopoietic system of positing itself. I really like thinking like all that is solid melts into air. What capital has done, it's taken things out of thin air and kind of concretized them and set them up as little Legos and little toy soldiers that we've been playing with all along. But capital's been doing its own thing, and that brings me to value, because like value is what gets its hooks in us. Value and utility, and that's why this idea of arbitrage is super interesting. The time element of like, it used to be, these are time-saving devices. This will actually make it so I can, tend to my crops and feed my children and love my family and do all these things. So I need to do this, engage in this type of exchange. But now that it's microseconds, it's nanoseconds, like it's still time, and we still see it as value. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't think I have a question. I think I'm just like gushing over here, kind of like fangirling out a little bit.
I mean, value is it's great to bring up value. I mean, because that's something that we ignore a lot. Like, we're really, really interested in price. And I would say we're really interested in exchange value, right? Like, exchange value to us is what value ultimately is from the perspective of capital, which is if you I actually really like what you're trying to describe. Like, I think what we are ultimately trying to do is give a sense of what capital's own understanding of itself might be. Like, that does feel like very much analogous to what it is that we're trying to do. Without spending too much time looking at the debris or the waste that Bataille is describing, but really actually looking from the perspective of capital, which is basically looking directly at the sun and saying, I have all of this. Like, I have something that is functionally infinite, at least for, within the time scale that I'm operating at the moment. I have something that I can just consume. And like, there could be other capital that is existing at much, much higher scales, right? That is absorbing other suns or black holes or galaxies. I mean, it doesn't matter. Like, there exists such a significant energetic surplus that could be mobilized or metabolized according to these structures. That's totally something that we're interested in. I think we've been kind of teasing in a couple of lectures the idea that for us, like the real labor is nuclear fusion, right? Like, that's what labor ultimately is from the perspective of capital. That's also like something that I'm really interested in while watching the kind of complexity of American data center investments right now, which I think have a lot more to do with gamifying the drag of Trump's big, beautiful bill that allow you to do all kinds of really interesting things with depreciating assets, especially short-term depreciating assets. But I think is what data center investment is all about. But it does bring us to this place where we're grappling with raw energetics, which I don't think are priced into the economy in any kind of real way. Energy is incredibly catastrophically cheap in economic terms, and we're about to have a reckoning in that regard. But I also think we're going to have potentially a pivot towards nuclear in a really interesting way for precisely that reason, for the reason of capital ultimately trying to move itself into a position where it does have more direct access to the sun, or faster or more unmediated access to kind of principles of energetic construction or transference, I guess, than that you would get through kind of strictly solar processes. But the question of value, so there's exchange value, which is obviously the kind of the justificatory engine of price from the perspective of capital, which is that this thing is worth more or less than this other thing in this context. And for us, like, a fundamental mechanic of capitalism is not trade. It's not, trade being just one underpinning aspect of arbitrage, which is for us the fundamental mechanic, which is that the only difference or the simplest or most kind of basic transaction that occurs under capitalism is one that just involves time. where just a thing, simply by virtue of its displacement in time, can accrue exchange value. That exchange value is essentially constructed by time. So the example here being something like an investment in some kind of ETF via high frequency trade or something like that, where you have there's a thing, there's a kind of acquisition of that thing, the value of that thing changes in terms of its exchange value, and you can then re-inject it back into the market and enjoy that price fluctuation as value that's returned back into your organization. That's for us value. There's also use value, of course, which is a huge component of this, right? Which is the utility of that pizza to my stomach and to my continued reproduction as a human being, which for us is increasingly something that is in this, fractal and ingrained dynamic between the human and capital, where you have dynamics of lift and drag that are moving things through. And you also have all these kind of tendrils moving to the last mile through which you're ultimately obtaining the raw materials and these are the more kind of scaled up processes through which you deliver things like flour, right, at some kind of scale that become really complex in terms of what those economies actually look like. But yeah, I mean, value to us, there is no use value in capitalism, right? I mean, that can't exist. And I mean, I think Marx also agrees, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think it has to do with the injection of volatility through the temporality of exchange. And I think one of the interesting arguments that you were trying to point out there, Nance, is that what happens at different temporalities, and what happens on temporalities that go beyond our ability to perceive, to understand, and that deeply relates to the idea of lift, of abstraction, and to everything that is being described within the book. The temporalities of exchange do vary and can get really, really intense. We were talking about the HFTs before, the velocity at which things can happen, the idea of algorithmic engagement with these mechanisms, where time becomes something else, it moves outside of the human domain, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to the question of value, I think a little bit. I mean, would it be helpful here? Could we say that you guys define value as hold?
yeah, exchange value is something that accrues within the hold process. And the hold process meaning you have buy, you have hold, you have sell, right? When you're taking something, you're owning it in a stock or some kind of options market or something like that. Buy it, you add it to your ledger, you hold. Time is the thing that rides that volatility. So you have the volatility of the market, which is stochastic and something that cannot be disassembled into the sum of its parts. That's definitely an argument. So that's the stochastic on the motion, turbulence. You buy, you ride that. That's the hold process through which exchange value is constructed or deducted, depending on the type of buy you did, and then the sell, right, which is just a recursive loop back to the buy. So that's, yes, the hold is the moment where exchange value is generated.
And this is a controversial point, obviously, for Marxists, because they still want to root value in the extraction of surplus value from the human. Well, then the question, I guess, for them, if that is the anchoring point of the argument that capitalism involves structural exploitation, this is where they would want to push back, correct?
Yeah, because what they want to do is they want to take that stochastic volatility wave, and they want to do some complex Fourier analysis until it is refracted into, a billion different streams of, activity done by humans in which labor was ultimately extracted, which is fair and reasonable, but a very difficult transformation to do, I think. Like a sufficiently difficult one that it loses its explanatory capacity. And instead it becomes much more interesting. I think it's really ultimately the best thing that you could do is have both perspectives in your brain simultaneously, because otherwise, it's always good to look at both sides of an issue. But we do think that if you're only looking at capital through that kind of analysis, where you're ultimately taking a look at a market, breaking it down into individual contributions by people, it's going to be really, really difficult to understand the mechanics of that market. It's actually very reasonable. This is something that we know from mathematics. Like, it's very reasonable to build toy models of things to help you actually explain mechanics based on principles that might be totally separate from these like more kind of aggregated small scale things that actually at different scalar levels, different phenomena arise. And those phenomena tend to be very much irreducible to components that occur on smaller scales.
And I think there's I mean, historically in Marxism, there's a shift maybe after Freud from the analysis of mass dynamics into a more kind of individualized approach and so on, where nowadays post-Marxist thinking kind of moves in between those two framings. But we also, I think generally we're looking at the bottom-up definition of what capital, how capital operates and so on. And what we're trying to do here is to take a different perspective and look at a top-down analysis. And there's going to be some level of contradiction there that I think it's logical because we are looking at things from a completely different perspective. Yeah.
So, okay, I guess if exchange value is the dominant form of value now, is there any way to assert a different form of value over exchange value, or is the game over?
I don't think the game is over. I think it's really important for all humans to think about what it would mean to construct a economy based on use value at some kind of scale. That's a really important thing for us to do, and we just haven't done it. We haven't. And I think a lot of that has to do with also constructing that economy in such a way that really protects itself from the kind of viral nature of use value to permute into exchange value.
How do we set up a system where commodification cannot occur in certain areas? I don't know
exactly
what that means.
It's really, really, really hard. Really hard. Like, we have a couple answers. So we're not producing that answer. Like, to us, that's not something we're not capable of that. Like, we don't know the world that well. We have gotten some really interesting answers. The first I would say is from like Hito Steyrl. I've been reading. Have you read Peter Watts's Blind Sight at all? You guys, do you know this?
Yeah, dude. Yes.
Yeah. Do you know ecopraxia? So there's this idea of like actually sentience being bad. Like actually like we have to go to a kind of pre-sapient, pre-sentient sort of place. Like that's the level that actually needs to occur in order for us to avoid the temptation to produce this kind of abstraction through which we ultimately find things moving from spaces of, raw materiality and utility to spaces of exchange and relative spaces, right? So that could be one argument. Is like we have to become kind of pre-sapient. Like that's one argument.
Return to monkey.
Exactly. Return to monkey. But like even maybe before, yeah.
Return to pre-monkey. I think there's a compelling pull to that kind of primitive.
AI is a great example of this. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's important that we say no. I refuse that. Like I enjoy my subjectivity. I enjoy my misery. Not enjoy in the super egoic sense, but I am all said and done at the end of the day, I'm happy to be here, even though it could be better. And I think it's important that we defend that and we say no. We can find a way to kind of resist this commoditization, this objectification. I think that's it. Like that's the thing. We are the subject. We have to remain subjects.
So another answer we got was from Max Valenchik. Do you guys know Max by any chance? Max is like a very, very good Nick Land scholar.
I recently, I think we talked on a little bit, and he's the one doing the work on psychotic acceleration. Yes.
Exactly. So he came up to us after talking. He was like, "But Land gave you an answer. like Land absolutely has an answer to this question. You're not going to like it, but he does have an answer, which I think is also fair, right? Like, I mean, there's totally an answer through which you can build a kind of like incredibly violent structure that prevents this type of commodification from occurring, right? Like that is totally a possibility. And there are other possibilities too. I mean, another example would be to take something that looks almost like a left accelerationist position, which is to understand that if lift is occurring, how can you, if you really think, which I think is possible, that capital is a kind of fundamentally indifferent actor, it seems possible that it could be leveraged as a type of machinery, right? As a kind of tool. But that requires some really complex thinking that we're not doing. Like there's a lot of like early stage kind of ideas around what this looks like. Like Web3 is like one kind of way of formulating an answer to this problem, but I don't think it's nearly a sophisticated enough way of engaging what it means to deal with the problematics of abstraction being a kind of mill through which something can actually be harvested in a kind of energetic way that could be leveraged for human metabolic processes as opposed to its own metabolic drives. But that's hopefully like I would love Exocapitalism to be one of the one of the books that begins that more kind of higher level conversation. Like I do think that that's possible. Yeah.
So
another is like pre-scale, like. We need to all get kind of like not return to monkey quite, but like we need to really abolish scale. That would also be another kind of possibility here that like any kind of scalar activity seems problematic, really become quite isolated. The less relational points. Yeah.
I mean, that could be like us riding our little Dunbar's number spaceships out into space, into this kind of plurality. And that sounds super utopian. It also sounds kind of naive, but I mean, like that ideal for the model of, what's the book? The Dispossessed, Ursula Le Guin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the greatest books of all time.
One of the greatest anarchist books of all time.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I feel like asking the question. Reading the book, I'm like, so are we just kind of doomed to fall into the last bloody mile? Like, is that the future of humanity? Like that's coming for us, and capital will kind of melt back into air, and we'll just be doing this barbaric.
I could see it's more like a cycle, right? Like we collapse in the last bloody mile. We then, I mean, like it's a shepherd tone. Like we then reconstruct capitalism from within the last bloody mile, right? And just do it again endlessly. Like that feels really likely to me. Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah. Because I don't think like I think I'm very, very interested in AI. Like that's primarily like my kind of subject matter expertise. And like I think that the idea that AI is going to lead directly to a labor crisis is very much exaggerated. I think what's leading to a labor crisis is something that has much more to do with an ability to scale up and realize the automatic generation of capital from itself without human intervention. Like that's what ultimately is driving a labor crisis. It's not really AI, but I could definitely imagine that AI could be something that's leveraged again within this kind of weird shepherd tone of creating new kind of odd capitalisms from within the last mile. Because it's always bubbling up. I mean, it always is. It's really difficult. It's a repressive thing that I think ultimately have to talk about.
There's something important also about the way I think the book is framed, and there's a different violence to raising a question and answering it. It's a completely different engagement with this one, and the book engages in that first part. We did not want to move into that second part because that's not something that we have to do, and there's a complexity, and even if you want a darkness to that, so I guess we think of it more as a trigger, and we believe that framing things right does in a way represent a form of action, or a starting point, or a facilitator for new answers and new discourse, new arguments, new dialogue.
I got a couple questions, and then I want to go back to AI for a little bit, and then we'll wrap this up.
All right, I think Roberto might be dying. Just flagging that. What is it like?
I'm okay.
1 a.m. now?
I'll survive.
Okay. Yeah.
Just a little bit more. We're almost there. Home stretch. Okay.
Oh yeah.
All right. So if Marx's formula for capital is MC M prime, then what would your formula for capital be?
MM prime, baby.
MM prime.
We actually have a little diagram where it says, where it's like, so M, C, M prime. Obviously, you have those arrows in between. If we remove the C, write the Earth, and then we go this over from M to
Okay.
M prime. Yeah. Yeah.
We can share that. We can share that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now, you got economies with absolutely no limits. I've always heard that the limit of capital is capital itself. And, this, of course, this comes out of the Marxist tradition. But you also have this Lacanian, like I can hear the Lacanian response to this, which is if capitalism has no crises, no intrinsic contradictions, then is exo-capital a figure of the unbarred big other? Which is to say, is it a figure of a being that is basically a pure substance? It has no internal split. It has no contradiction within itself. Now, the Lacanian default setting is to say, well, there is no such thing as an unbarred big other. Everything, and this is the Hegelian dimension here. Everything is structured by contradiction, by an intrinsic limit. So I'm just curious about how you would respond to this type of pushback, where simply put, the Lacanians would say an economy with no intrinsic limit is a phantasmatic image of an economy. And so, yeah, what would you say to this Lacanian Hegelian pushback?
I mean, my Lacan is not like excellent, but I do understand what the big other is, which does feel like a lot like a kind of class of transcendental objects. But I don't think that like just proposing that something is transcendental or pre-structured. I mean, again, this is where we gesture at mea su as a kind of answer here necessarily has to be that contradiction, that being free of contradictions doesn't necessarily impose a lack of limitations. Like you could argue that the limit of computation is the incomputable or something like that. But I think Beatrice Faze would argue that the incomputable is the engine of computation in a lot of ways, right? That it is like the grand opportunity of computation. So, I mean, it depends on, I guess, what your definition of limitation is. For us, like, what we are ultimately proposing is, again, this idea of capital as an object that is transcendental, like absolutely a transcendental object, to which, of course, there's going to be a lot of thinkers that are going to have problems with that. Hegel will have his own class of problems with that I think we're much more comfortable with than problems that are coming from, let's say, post-humanist discourse, which is something that we are actively trying to break. Like, we're incredibly tired of post-humanist discourse where everything is relational to everything else. Everything is discoverable through everything else. There's a kind of flat ontology of that ultimately boils down to the egg, to some kind of pure immanence. Like, this is where the fold actually really gets applied in a way that we find very frustrating. Everything is kind of networked. Emergence is kind of the only transcendental operation that is proposed within those spaces, and we think that there's quite a few more that are ignored. Our cosmology is one that's full of extreme disjuncture, extreme separation, chasms, incommutable places, impossibilities. Like, those to us are all very productive things as opposed to unproductive things. So yes, I would say that this maybe gestures to the question of what a limitation is and what the relationship between limitation and contradiction is. Like, I'm thinking about like the fundamental axiomatic structure of mathematics, something like this. Like the degree to which we've been able to define an axiomatic structure of mathematics is really complicated, right? Like, we've been able to define some axiomatic structuration, but of course we've also at the same time uncovered some incredibly beautiful contradictions within that structure that prevent it from being kind of totalizable as such, while at the same time proposing that it is indeed something that is totalizable as such, right? And that's beautiful. Like, to us, that's incredibly beautiful and stimulating, a productive thing, as opposed to something that signals a problem. So yeah, I think we'd look at problems like incompleteness or incomputability as opportunities rather as foreclosures of a necessary relationship to the material, or determination upon the material, or limitation drawn to the material, which we don't think is the case here.
Okay, so I guess I want to kind of conclude by just asking you, okay, so we talked about the land influence. You're talking about a software economy, but where does AI and especially the idea of artificial superintelligence fit in? So I say, what is the relation between capital or the software economy and the production of artificial superintelligence? Is lift the lift into artificial superintelligence, i.e., the pathway to Robo Cthulhu?
Yeah, Robo Cthulhu. I love Robo Cthulhu. I think what's, again, kind of really critical to our worldview is the idea, as Roberto was saying earlier, that technology or computation are on their own kind of path that is, they're part of the same class in software terms, let's say, of objects that capitalism is, but they have their own draws, right? And so as capitalism enters and wiggles its way through our material conditions, so too does technology and computation, right? In their own, and of course you can break that down into a number of other constitutive transcendental objects that are all kind of colliding with a variety of different opportunities and a variety of different motivations and capacities at the same time. So like I don't think that the drive towards artificial superintelligence is something that is driven by capitalism. No, like capitalism is driving towards lift. The extent to which we see investment in AI is precisely aligned with anything that might serve the general kind of gesture of lift. Like we see lots of investment into let's say, I mean, Google just released this recently, but like the capacity for things like autonomous agents to undergo transactions at some kind of scale, right? Like that is a thing that AI is really interested in doing. We see a lot of AI companies very much interested in, how do I turn this particular model that I've constructed into an opportunity for B2B SaaS integration, right? Like that is 1,000% a governing structure that's being placed on this type of development. That's what reinforcement learning from human feedback is ultimately delivering us, right? Like it's delivering us precisely a series of at some kind of scale, to the extent that you lose that kind of decisional grid. Like it's not decisions, but you do see at scale these kind of filters placed on AI in order to make it useful for B2B SaaS. Like that's 100% something that's being done. But that doesn't mean that AI is not in itself producing some very interesting complications and internally driven opportunities for things like AI, right? That like we got to the place that we are in AI because of a series of very interesting accidents and discoveries that were to a certain extent correlated to, and to a certain extent decorrelated to, the flow of capital. It's like there's a big fog of war out there, right, on a variety of different dimensions, and we're kind of groping our way through this kind of multidimensional fog of war, and figures appear in the mist that are surprising to us and really interesting. I don't know. I don't think that to me, and this is something Roberto and I write about quite a lot. Like to me, questions of intelligence become very much language games very quickly. But I would say that something that we take this from Peter Wolfendale pretty directly, that we would see characteristic of a real paradigm shift in what we're building in AI that kind of thrusts us towards an AGI. But again, we'll use Peter Wolfendale's model, would be the ability for AI to be continuously self-improving, which is a complicated thing that for us involves some amount of speciation occurring within that AI. And we see AI right now as a convergent project that feels like the entire world is working on simultaneously, driven by geopolitical considerations. So empire being one of these vectors within the book, being driven by capital. But it does feel like we're all building the same thing because of a number of different kind of complicated factors. But what we're not building is a type of system that could actually be continuously learning. That does feel like a limitation to the transformer model. And moreover, it's something that I don't think we have a solution for architecturally, because you need, in order to create an AI that's continuously self-learning, you do need ultimately the ability to, according to Peter Wolfendale, have that AI be incarnated, so situated in the world in some way, not necessarily physically, but it needs to have some kind of stake within the world, within a world. There needs to be some element of risk, and it needs also the ability to differentiate itself based on different experiences. And the way that we orchestrate software right now, the way we orchestrate AI is taking a single checkpoint and sharding it, billions of times across identically deployed software containers living within functionally identical data centers, right? And so when you're building a kind of structure where everything is ultimately reducible down to a single model, that model is not going to be allowed to speciate. It's not going to be allowed to branch out and develop and ultimately kind of fight against itself in some kind of adaptive war. Instead, it's just going to be contributions to the same thing over and over again. So the complication to AGI, from my perspective, has a lot to do with a very benign problem of like solving software containerization. Like, what does it mean to deploy software at some kind of scale, if without necessarily relying on deploying the same artifact every single time?
Yeah,
Complicated answer. Sorry. Yeah.
Reza also talks about self-betterment
Exactly.
in the spirit, which is an argument that is in a way related to what Pete discusses. But going back to the question, when we think about these transcendental objects, there are overlaps. There may be some level of co-opting, if you want. And at the end of the day, we're going back to this idea of the human perspective, where an alignment translates into an equation, where something that is aligned seems to be the same thing. And I think we acknowledge the overlaps, we acknowledge the co-opting, but we want to think of them as separate trajectories, separate kind of transcendental objects. Yeah.
Okay, last question. Given your work on Lyft and all the time and energy you've put into developing this and seeing this trajectory, I'm going to end on with a landing question. Does anything human make it out of the near future?
What do you think, Roberto?
I won't.
You won't, yeah. Yeah, I think totally. Absolutely. Because precisely because we're not dealing with a techno-capital singularity, but instead we're dealing with a variety of divergent and oftentimes quite at odds with each other forces, who definitely have the ability to kill a lot of people, for sure. But yeah, I don't know. I think the only way that the human doesn't make it its way out of the future has a lot less to do with a kind of transhuman elevation, more to do with the inevitability of nuclear war and large geopolitical conflict, which is maybe downstream of AI development in a lot of respects, but is really complicated in terms of its relationship to capital. And for us, has more to do with geography. Yeah, but I think we have a very different relationship to time. Like we really, yeah, to use Roberto's term of like wiggishness, like I think we really, both of us, live in like a kind of time graph that's totally not linear, to the extent that like a near future is like a complicated thing to discuss. Like yeah. Yeah, but I think so. I mean, like, we gave a talk recently called "How to Kill the Internet" that ended with the agreement that the only solution to that is like total nuclear war, which does feel right. So that's what I'd be looking at the answer to that question, more than techno-capital singularity, which to me feels really unlikely, actually. Yeah, I think we're going to see the techno-capital singularity will be occurring, and we're going to see people, just like Daniel Felsted and Jen Leung talk about so poetically, riding around on motorcycles through the streets of Vietnam, patched into like 40 different software applications, simultaneously delivering food to other people. That feels likely.
There's also complexity to the question itself, and Marek was mentioning before, when he was discussing intelligence, that it's very easy to move into word games and so on.
Yeah.
And the question of the human is another example of this. If we try to start defining what we actually mean by that, a term that is so charged and so on, my answer would be yes. that maybe the term needs to be dropped altogether.
Yeah, Reza's inhuman, I think, is like a really great way to think about that. Yeah, the human is changing for sure.
Well, guys, this has been so awesome. I appreciate
Thank you so much.
you
This
being
was
here,
so
especially.
fun.
I mean, both of you, but Roberto for staying here, being sick. We appreciate
It's
it so
okay.
much.
No.
And hopefully, like I said, we would love to have you guys back. There's so many more, questions and lines of thought we'd love to explore with you. But congratulations on writing an amazing book. It's going to continue to be a huge influence in the decades to come. Before we leave, tell everybody about this course that you're teaching at the New Center and how they can get access, sign up.
Yeah, take our course at the New Center. It's going to be a lot of this, but very historically situated. I think we really want to give like a very kind of cosmic view, and kind of correlate capitalism to very, very large distributions of history in terms of geography and also in terms of time. So really definitely want to get wild with it. I'm so obsessed with ecopraxia right now that I think I'll probably also be talking about that a little bit. Like I am really interested in talking about sapience a little bit. I think it's gonna be killer. Go to the New Center website. It's really easy to sign up, and we're both big fans of the New Center and what it's trying to accomplish. I think is like really amazing.
Yeah.
And come see us this March, I think early March in New York, and hopefully some other places on the East Coast, and so many other announcements that we just can't talk about.
Come to KC. Come to KC.
Oh my God, I love KC. Hell yeah, we would totally come to KC. That would be sick, actually.
So cool to get to meet you guys.
That would be fire. I love KC actually.
Nance, you'd have to come in for it.
Oh, fucking road trip, like no question. I would fucking be there.
Hell
yeah.
And we got to get you on the pod too, because also congratulations to you for like also an incredibly influential and important book that we'd love to.
I'm just ready for it to be back out, but like
yeah,
I said,
exactly.
we're working
once
on
it's
it.
out,
coming soon.
Totally.
Hell yeah,
amazing.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hell yeah. This is such an honor, guys.
Oh, no, the honor's all ours. This is,
thank you guys for real.
Seriously, thank you so much. Because again, like you guys are going to take off and become theory stars. And so we're here at the beginning. So we're the ones who feel honored.
Hey, man, we don't consider ourselves done until we're on Tucker Carlson, man.
This kind of satanic panic 2.0 thing, I don't know about. Do I really believe all these tech bros are trying to summon lemurs in Silicon Valley?
I wish that would be so sick if that was actually the case. I would be so happy.
Better than what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Like right now,
exactly.
they're just trying to lift off now.
Yeah, exactly.